You're listening to The Stall and Stable Show, ideas for happy horsekeeping.
Deciding what to feed our horses can be daunting. Some horse owners rely on their trainers for guidance, others rely on the barn manager, or even random tidbits from the internet. Thankfully, there are people and companies for whom equine nutrition is a specialty. In this second episode of our new Triple Crown series, I'm joined by Dr. Clair Thunes, a Ph.D. and equine nutrition expert, to answer questions submitted by our listeners. In this episode, we discuss feed bag labels and how to interpret them, which supplements are necessary in the winter, why salt is important, and a lot more. So listen in. This is episode 135 of the Stall and Stable Show, brought to you by American Stalls and Triple Crown Nutrition. Today's Wednesday, January 31st, 2024. I'm your host, Helena Harris. The Stall and Stable Show is made possible with the generous support of our sponsors. Please show them your support by learning more about what they do. You can find details at stallandstable.com/support. One of the best ways to understand how a company performs in the marketplace is to take a look at their Google reviews. I partnered with American Stalls because I believe in what the company does, but let me read you a quick Google review so you can get an idea of what other people think. A horse owner named Katrin wrote, "When I began looking for stall door upgrade options in the barn I just bought, I did hours of research and talked to many companies. I chose American Stalls because their customer service was second to none. Together, we went over the options, I sent pictures, and was upfront with my budget. When the stall doors arrived, I was thrilled as they exceeded all of my expectations. My horses are happy and safe, and my stable looks amazing. Thank you, American Stalls. Great company, high quality." To learn more about what American Stalls offers, visit them online at americanstalls.com. Dr. Clair Thunes is a Ph.D., equine nutritionist, busy pony club mom, and a dressage and eventing enthusiast. She also owns Clarity Equine Nutrition, an independent consulting company based in Gilbert, Arizona. Her services include working with owners and veterinarians to create diets for individual horses, ranging from retired pasture pets to Olympic athletes. She also formulates feeds and supplements for companies, and there's a good chance you've scooped something she helped develop into your horse's bucket. Clair taught equine nutrition and physiology as an adjunct professor at the University of California, Davis, and is a highly sought-after speaker, so I am very, very lucky to have her as a guest today. So without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Clair Thunes to the show as we discuss some of the questions submitted by listeners. Hi, Clair, and welcome to the Stall and Stable podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
I love having the opportunity to talk with experts in the field, and nutrition is a lot more than just a specialty. I mean, it is a specialty, but we're learning now in 2024 that nutrition is responsible for so much about our horses' well-being. It's not just about what goes in their mouth. It's about their mental health, their physical health, their longevity, their sustainability. So I'm really happy that this is that you're a voice in the horse world for what nutrition is and what it can be.
Yeah, no, it's an exciting field. And of course, I've been thinking that about nutrition for a long time, but it's exciting that now I feel like, everything's kind of starting to see that.
Yeah, it's like everybody's on the bandwagon now, and you're like,
yeah,
thank God.
Exactly. I know, yeah. It only took, 15 years that I've been doing it. So.
Well, horse people are not known to be early adopters. We're very like, don't take my knowledge away from me.
Yeah, for sure.
So we have a couple of discussion points. I had asked some of our listeners for questions, what's their most pressing nutrition question? What's really been bugging them? So some of the questions we're going to go over today are from Stall and Stable listeners. So thank you for submitting those.
Great.
But we're going to start with something kind of generic, which though really, this question comes up even for people who've been taking care of horses for a long time like me. With so many different kinds of horses, environments, work, overall health, where does one start to develop a feed program that would support their particular horse's lifestyle? Where's the first place you go?
I go to their digestive tract anatomy and how they evolved to eat. Because yes, they're all different breeds and we keep them in all different ways. But at the end of the day, it's a horse is a horse is a horse. And they're all, put together the same way. And I think when we understand how they evolved to eat and their digestive tract anatomy and physiology, and we keep that as sort of the starting point for our nutrition programs, then we won't go far wrong. They, evolved on the plains of North America, eating, mostly grasses and similar plants and having to migrate, fair distances in either day to day or every few days in order to find enough to eat. And the plants that were out there were not very high nutritional value. They were stemmy, they were unimproved pasture grasses. And I think they weren't pasture grasses, they were just, shrubby grasses that were out on the rangeland. And I think when we think of how horses evolved to eat, we think about pastures and we think about these sort of immaculate green, type things. And the reality is that's not what they evolved to eat. Those are improved grass species that were developed by scientists to put gain on a steer. And we then feed them to horses and, they'll put a kilo of gain on your Morgan as well, or your Pasofino or your pony. And that may not be the best thing for those horses. So when you understand that because the nutritional value of that forage was so low, they had to eat 16, 18 hours per day, right? So their digestive tract evolved to eat very little all the time, right? So they're eating all the time. So they have a sort of a trickle feed approach to eating. 60% of their digestive tract volume is dedicated to the fermentation of forages because that's what they were eating. That's what makes an herbivore, is that they have a specialized fermentation vat somewhere in their digestive tract to ferment forages that contain microbes, and the microbes do that fermentation for the animal. And in the horse, that's the cecum and colon. And so horses have a very developed cecum and colon hindgut, and that's really what we're feeding. And the forages that we're feeding are feeding those microbes in the hindgut. And if we can keep those microbes happy, then we generally have a pretty happy horse. So, we've all heard that we should be feeding forage as a foundation of our diets. Well, that's why, because 60% of their digestive tract volume is dedicated to the fermentation of forage. At the same time, because they eat almost constantly, they are constantly secreting stomach acid. So that's not the case for you and I. Like, we secrete stomach acid in response to a meal or in preparation to a meal, kind of like that Pavlov's dog thing, right? Where we smell dinner and suddenly we go, wow, like we're really hungry. And suddenly our saliva is flowing and our stomach acid's kind of flowing. And horses don't do that. Horses secrete stomach acid all the time because they're designed to be eating all the time. And because they're eating all the time, they're then chewing all the time. And the act of chewing secretes saliva. And saliva contains bicarbonate, which buffers stomach acid. So it's this beautiful system of the constantly secreted stomach acid being constantly buffered by the constant eating of forages. And then we came along and screwed it all up by saying, we're going to feed you, right? We're going to put you in a stall, we're going to domesticate you, and we're going to feed you breakfast and dinner. And we wonder why we have all the problems with colic and, stuff that we do, right? So for me, I start all of my feeding programs by just keeping that in the back of my mind. How is the horse designed to be fed? I don't care if it's a miniature horse, if it's a Clydesdale pulling a Budweiser dray, whether it's a, Olympic dressage horse, that reality is the same for all of those horses. So I always start with forage as a foundation. And then I look at my forage and I say, well, can I maintain my horse on just forage? Is he maintaining his weight? Is he able to do the job he needs to do just on forage, whether that's pasture or conserved forage like hay? If the answer is yes, then what I need is what's missing in those forages. And what's typically missing in forages are trace minerals, copper, zinc, in some regions, selenium. If you're feeding a hay, maybe the quality of the protein is not as good as it could be. So maybe a source of quality protein is a good idea. Hay is not very high in vitamin E, so, maybe need that as well. And so I don't need calories because my horse is in great shape and good condition. I just need those missing pieces. And those missing pieces typically are provided by what we call in the industry a ration balancer, which is a highly fortified feed with a small serving size. So they're designed, you only feed 1 or 2 pounds per day. They're not designed to give you a lot of calories. They're heavily fortified. They're a bit like your, multivitamin type of, 1 a day type deal, right? Like you just feed 1 pound, 2 pounds of it max, and your needs are taken care of along with your forage.
Okay. So I'm going to simplify this because I'm a simple person.
Yep.
So in looking at the horse's body, the way the animal has evolved to survive, they've evolved to basically live off of scrubland. I mean, I say this about ponies and even my own horse, Brody. He's an easy keeper because his body has evolved to eat, to make the best of whatever is available. Okay, so then we introduce a lot of human ideals to the horse's environment, and their bodies can't always adjust to that. And so we really need to go backwards, actually take a step backwards and say, maybe all of these luxuries that we're affording our horses are not really in the best interest of their physical health.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So forage in some form is the place to start because that is what the horse, that's what that their body needs. Then we fill in the gaps based on what we see anecdotally, clinically, right?
Right, exactly.
Okay. So then that kind of segues into the next question. Do all horses need grain? I know I hear these words being used sometimes interchangeably, concentrates and grain. Can you explain the difference between those and which horses might need grain and which, how does that fit into our horse's diet?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we run into confusion sometimes with these things between those of us in the industry and how we use the terms and those out in the field, the horse owners, and how they use the terms. So to me, as a nutritionist, the term grain means like grains, like corn, oats, and barley. That to me is a grain. That's what they are, they're grains. However, most horse enthusiasts, when you say the word grain, they mean something that they buy in a 50-pound bag at the feed store, which may or may not actually be a grain by my definition of it being a grain, corn, oats, and barley type of thing, right? So it gets very confusing because I've even had people say, oh, my horse gets, in his grain, and I ask them what it is, and they say, oh, he gets a pound of alfalfa pellets. And I'm like, well, that's not a grain, that's a hay pellet. But because it's something that they scoop out of a bag and put in a bucket and give to their horse, they label it grain, even though technically it's not a grain. So that's where a lot of confusion, I think, comes from sometimes, in the industry, is like how we use the terms and then how they get used kind of out in the field. And so, as I said, to me, a grain is going to be pretty high in starch because that's what those traditional wheat, corn, oats, barley tend to be pretty high in starches. And so if I am thinking about grain in the sense of like a commercial feed, I'm thinking of something that's sort of a higher calorie performance type feed. And these days that may or may not be higher in starch. A concentrate is something that provides a nutrient in a concentrated form. And so you might have a protein concentrate that provides, a really high level of protein. You see those out there, some protein supplements. You might have it's like a fat concentrate that's a really high fat ingredient product that you're sort of putting in your horse's diet purely to get more calories in them. The protein one you'd be putting in there purely to get, more quality protein, or it might be a really concentrated source of minerals. But again, concentrate often gets used as a term, for commercial feed that you buy in a bag. And so it gets really confusing.
Do you think it's important for the average horse owner to understand the difference?
I don't know. I think it's important for them to understand that, if you're going to use grain or concentrate as a collective term for something that comes in a bag that you buy at the feed store, is to understand that, they're not all bad in inverted commas. We've sort of kind of reached this point where people are very anti-starch, right? They don't want to feed their horses too much starch and sugar because there can be metabolic consequences of that, especially in some horses. And we've become kind of afraid of starch and sugar. And, some horses need starch and sugar, depending on the type of work they're doing and the jobs that they have. Like, if you're working anaerobically, you cannot burn fat anaerobically. So there's a place in some horses' diets for some higher starch and sugar. Like I talked about ration balances earlier. I hear people refer to them as grain. Oh, I don't want to feed my horse any grain. And they think of a ration balancer as grain because it comes in a pellet and it's in a 50-pound bag at the feed store. So it's a grain. But it's not grain in the sense of being like a super high starch, high calorie type feed. It's more of a concentrate in that it's high in protein, high in trace minerals, high in vitamins. And it actually has a lot of benefit to the horses because it's providing them everything that's missing in their forage. And it helps create that balanced overall nutrition profile the horses need to be healthy.
I found the distinction between the two words helpful for me, especially when talking to nutritionists or my veterinarian or explaining to even shopping for feed to explain what I'm looking for. And even for understanding, okay, I'm looking for a ration balancer or even a hay pellet, like alfalfa pellets come in a bag. They come in a 50-pound bag, but that would be considered a concentrate, right?
Well, it's a forage, so I wouldn't call that a concentrate.
Okay.
But to me, an alfalfa pellet is a roughage or a forage because it's just alfalfa that's been chopped and put in a bag and pelleted and put in a bag. So to me, that falls into the forage category. Beet pulp's the same way. Beet pulp falls into the forage category as well, because they both require microbial fermentation in the hindgut. So they're technically forages.
So forage requires microbial fermentation in the hindgut.
Yeah, to me, that's, it's a. And then you have to be careful because some alfalfa pellets have a vitamin mineral pack added to them.
So you have to read your labels.
You do. You do. It's tricky, right? So you do have to is it just an alfalfa pellet? I can think where I buy my feed. We have a local brand that they just have straight alfalfa pellets. And it's just, alfalfa and some bentonite to kind of help make the pellet. And then they have a brand that's an alfalfa pellet with a vitamin mineral pack in it. And it's got added copper and zinc and selenium and vitamin A, D, and E and what have you. And, those, you have to think about maybe how you feed those. Like I add the alfalfa pellets on top of my ration balancer because, for example, our pony is a fairly easy keeper. I like him to have a little bit of alfalfa, but he doesn't need like the whole of a flake. Like our flakes here are huge. They're like 7-8 pounds a day. He doesn't need that much. He just needs like 2 or 3 pounds of alfalfa. So it's easier for me to do that in a pellet than it is to say, hey guys, can you give him half a flake? That's a pain, right? I mean, nobody wants to do that.
Right.
Nobody wants to do half flakes, right? Nobody wants to do that. And so I do alfalfa pellets, but I feed him a ration balancer already. Like I would not want to add on top of his ration balancer a fortified alfalfa pellet because I'd be over fortifying his diet. So I have to be careful when I go to the store that I buy the right one.
Yeah. Yeah. So so talking about feed bag labels, because they can be confusing, especially from brand to brand. Typically, how complete are those labels and what are we looking for when reading them? Because horses are very different. You can have your performance horse, your pleasure horse, your young horse, your breeding horse. Let's just take, for the sake of this conversation, the average light performing competitive pleasure horse, right? Just low level, mid level competitive horse in whatever discipline. What are we looking for on feed bag labels with that kind of horse in mind?
Yeah, I mean, all the feed labels, there's standardization between feed labels. Okay, so feed labels, what you can put on a feed label is governed by the state in which this feed is being sold in. So every feed has every state has regulations on what has to be on a feed label. So there are several things that are required on a feed label. There is what we call the Model Feed Act, which gave kind of overall guidelines generally about, in general, this is what should be on a feed label. And most states have adopted that. And then some as a minimum. And then some have added, and we want to see this as well, kind of thing. So, for example, what has to be on a feed label? You have to have the name of the feed. There needs to be a purpose statement. So you should be able to know pretty easily by looking at that bag, is this feed aimed at that horse you were just describing, or is it a feed for a broodmare? Now, sometimes that's going to be pretty obvious from the name of the feed. Like if the feed's called senior, it's senior horse, it's probably pretty obvious that feed is for senior horses. Otherwise, if it's got some funky marketing, I'm making this up, whatever name or whatever, equifeed or what have you, you're like, well, what the heck's that for? Right? That could be for any kind of horse. And so there had to be a purpose statement. Feed for horses at maintenance and light work or something, or a feed for brood mares and young stock, or something that tells you who you should be feeding that to. There's got to be a guaranteed analysis, and there are some minimum requirements that have to be on the guaranteed analysis. I mean, pretty much every state is going to guarantee protein, fat, and fiber. And then some states you have to guarantee ash. Ash is the collection of all your mineral. And then you get into some specific requirements. Certain states are like, well, if you have more than this much ash or this much calcium, you have to start breaking out that and phosphorus. And so a lot of states now, and feed manufacturers are realizing that people are getting smart, right? We want to know what's in our feeds. And so they're now starting to tell us more and more on that guaranteed analysis. So you'll pretty much typically always get, protein, fat, fiber. The national brands are probably going to give you your amino acids as well. So lysine, methionine, threonine are pretty common. Calcium, phosphorus. You'll get copper, zinc. You may or may not get manganese. And then you'll get like vitamins A, D, and E. And then you might get some free probiotic type values as well.
Even though what's listed on the labels are governed by the individual states, are the ratios typically the same?
Between all the numbers, like all the amounts of all the things?
Yeah.
No, those will differ. So that's where you start to kind of get into like, well, do I want company A's senior or company B's senior? So that some of those values are going to be different. One might have more protein than the other. One might have more fat than the other. One, so that's where you start to look at the differences and kind of start to be able to judge the composition of that feed. And then the other thing that's going to really help you is the ingredient list. So that's also required on the label. And typically those are listed in decreasing order of inclusion. So the first thing on the ingredient list is going to be more of that in the feed than anything else. And it's going to go on down. So I always look at the first 5 or 6 ingredients because that tells me quite a lot. So for example, your ration balances, typically the first ingredient's probably going to be soybean meal. And coinciding with that, the guaranteed analysis for that feed is probably going to be about 30% protein, because soybean meal is really high in protein. So you'd expect that.
That's 30% of what whole?
Oh, yes. 30% of that feed is going to be protein. And so that won't matter if you feed a pound, 2 pounds, 3 pounds, 30% it's 30% of that feed is going to be protein.
Got it. Okay.
So if you've got soybean meal as the first ingredient, I'm going to expect the protein to be pretty high. If I have oats as my first ingredient, I'm going to expect that feed to be pretty high in starch because I know that oats is a grain and has pretty high starch. Now, there's no requirement to list starch on a feed. So there are requirements in certain states. Like if you say that your feed is a low starch feed, like if you make marketing claims about a feed, if you call out a nutrient in your marketing, then that should be on your guaranteed analysis. Like, so if you say that this feed is a low starch, low sugar feed, then that feed is probably going to have what we call an NSC value, which stands for non-structural carbohydrate. And they're going to give you a percentage of the NSC in that feed. And so you'll see that listed on the ingredient list. But there's, if you're not making those claims, you don't have to say how much starch and sugar is in your feed. And so if I'm seeing a lot of traditional grains, corn, oats, and barley type of thing in the first several ingredients, I'm going to know that's a pretty high starch feed. The other thing that's going to tell me that that's the case is when I look at the fiber will probably be pretty low because those ingredients are fairly low in fiber. If I've got, beet pulp, alfalfa meal as the first couple of ingredients, then my fiber content is going to be pretty high, right? So that's going to be your senior feeds. They're probably going to have pretty high fiber. They may or may not have fairly high fat. What's interesting is most of the ingredients, like raw ingredients that get put into feed, like wheat middlings, beet pulp, alfalfa meal, oats, soybean meal, they're all pretty low in fat. So without an added fat source, most feeds would be around 4 or 5% fat, pretty low. So if you have a feed that has a crude fat of like 8%, 10%, 12%, then we know that there's an added fat source in that feed. And you're typically going to see vegetable oil or like rice bran or maybe some flaxseed in that ingredient list, because those are all high fat ingredients. So you start to if you understand the kind of composition of ingredients, you can start to better understand where your nutrients are coming from. And then you get to look at the guaranteed analysis that then tells you some of what the nutrient values actually are. And then perhaps one of the most important and often ignored part of the label will be the feeding directions.
Yes. Yes.
And this is really where people get into trouble. I can't tell you how many people, sort of say, oh, I feed my horse, X pounds of hay per day. And then they get, 2 pounds of a senior feed or 1.5 pounds of a performance feed. And I always say, well, have you read the feeding directions? And so we pull up the feeding directions and they take a look, and they're, 1,200 pound warm blood or whatever in light work. It says they need a minimum of 8 pounds of this performance feed per day, and their eyes fall out of their head, right? And they sort of say, oh my golly, if I fed that, then my, horse would be obese or it'd buck me off or, whatever. And I'm like, well, then you've done the right thing in that you're feeding to condition, right? You're feeding a diet to make your horse the correct body condition, but you've selected a feed that you can't feed it the correct way in order to achieve that body condition, right? It says you're supposed to feed 8 pounds and you're only feeding 2. So yes, your horse is in a great body condition, but they're going to be nutrient deficient because the manufacturer put that together with a specific serving size in mind, and you're not doing that.
I'm guilty of that. I'm guilty of that.
Lots of people are. It's a very common mistake.
First of all, anybody who says I'm feeding my horse X pounds of anything, that's a step in the right direction. From I'm feeding my horse 3 scoops or 2 flakes. Something I try to help a lot of my clients do is figure out how much it costs them to keep a horse. Yeah. And I'm telling them, well, you should be feeding X amount of pounds. How much are you paying for your hay per pound? And everybody goes, I don't know. So making the translation from whatever unit of measure that they're used to weight is a big step in the right direction. But I think there's this old myth that certain horses have, they have a propensity to get hot if they have too much protein or alfalfa or grain and all the sugars. And things have changed so much in the last decade. That's definitely not really a major factor anymore in what affects a horse's personality. I mean, we're learning more about how their environment affects their personality and their hotness or their anxiety as opposed to their diet. But like I said, we're loath to let go of some of these old myths. So I think I underfeed, which we don't have to talk about my horses in particular, but a lot of people kind of can relate. I have 2 thoroughbred mares and they are on Triple Crown Senior. I'm trying to give them, right? So yeah, it's formulated for senior horses, but it's been so helpful for these younger horses. I don't want them to have a lot of sugar. I also have a horse who is type E for some kind of metabolic syndrome, even though he's not. Right. So there's a fear, I think, that holds our hand away from that scoop. So what do you say about that? How can we overcome that fear?
Yeah, well, the solution is to pick a different feed, right? That you can feed at the correct amount. So if you're, feeding, half a scoop of senior and 2 pounds of senior a day, like you're saying, you're feeding that Triple Crown Senior, that particular feed has a minimum serving size of like 6 pounds a day for an average size horse. And so if you're just feeding a couple of pounds and they're looking great on that, you've done a great job in feeding to condition, but they're going to be missing some pretty important nutrients. So instead, if you switched to the ration balance that they offer, that has a 1 to 2 pound serving size. It's also low in starch and sugar, but it's very highly fortified. And so you'd get all your vitamins and minerals in that 2 pound, 1 pound serving size that you're not getting by feeding the senior at, 1 or 2 pounds per day. Now, I will say that, people love, like the textured seniors, they make a great base for, if you need to add salt and, other things. It's a nice textured feed that stuff doesn't fall through it the way that pellets do. So, I could see still maybe having a little bit of senior in there if that's the case. I know a lot of people like it for that reason. But adding that ration balancer in there at the correct level is going to give your horses all the nutrition they need, still being low starch, low sugar, and their diet will be more complete. And what happens is that when people fall into the trap of feeding the senior feed or the performance feed incorrectly, because they're not getting all the vitamins and minerals those horses need, they end up with, maybe they're over time, the hoof quality starts to deteriorate, or maybe the coat quality isn't so good. So then they start reaching for a hoof supplement, or they start reaching for something to help their horse's coat be shiny, or, whatever the issue is. And the reality is if they actually had fed the correct feed or were feeding the feed in the correct way, then all of those deficits that are resulting in, potentially the poorer hoof quality would be fixed with the feed, and they wouldn't need their hoof supplement anymore. And I do that for a lot of people. Like, a lot of people come in to me and they're feeding, like you're mentioning, like 1 or 2 pounds of a senior feed. They've got a, farrier supplement or whatever, in their diet as well. And then I switch them to a ration balancer and get rid of their, hoof supplement, and they freak out and they're like, but you've gotten rid of my hoof supplement. And I'm like, but yes, but you know what? There's more copper and more zinc now coming into your horse's diet from this ration balancer than you were getting from the incorrect senior feeding plus the hoof supplement. So you're actually better off than you were, and your feed room is more simple, and you're probably spending less money.
Hey, I'm all for both of those things. So, I think I just inhaled a bug.
It's protein.
Yeah, protein. There's several more questions that I know we wanted to get to today, but we're eating up time like horses eat forage. I want to wrap up with, since we're talking about those gaps that our forage doesn't provide, since it's winter time in most of the United States right now, and a lot of horses are on hay and I want to say manufactured forage only, what are the most important supplements in the wintertime when we are feeding just hay?
Yeah, I mean, assuming that, I'd like to say you've added your ration balancer, so technically the diet is where it needs to be. 2 things I would be, maybe 3 things I'd be thinking to add. Salt. I'm a big believer in adding salt, because our horses don't often drink enough in the winter because it's cold. Their water sources are cold and they're not necessarily very motivated to drink. So we see a lot more impaction colic. Going into winter, that tends to be a bigger deal, especially if you've got a horse coming off of pasture, into a barn being fed hay. They're used to getting a lot more moisture from their grass, and they're not getting that now because they're getting hay, and it's not as warm out. They're not as motivated to drink. So making sure they have enough salt in their diet is really important for stimulating thirst and keeping them drinking. Conserved forages like hays don't have as high a level of vitamin E. And while, your commercial feeds should be meeting your horse's vitamin E requirement, we now know there's been a lot more research done on it. Different horses have different metabolisms of vitamin E. So you could have 2 or 3 horses, all fed the exact same thing. One will have a perfectly adequate vitamin E, another one will be deficient, and one might be marginally too high. So knowing that the longer they're on hay, the less vitamin E they've kind of got coming in from their forage. Like grass pasture, good quality grass pasture is very high in vitamin E, but it's not heat stable. So we lose that when we make hay. So as the winter goes on, the longer they're on hay, their body stores of vitamin E start to dwindle. And what's in your feed may or may not be enough vitamin E for your individual horse. So testing vitamin E is really important. And so for our performance clients who they're heading south for the winter, they tend to do performance evaluations, around Christmas, New Year kind of thing, adding a vitamin E to that, or just adding a vitamin E. If you have the vet out for something at this time, if you're adding a vitamin E test to it to make sure that your horse is getting enough vitamin E is really important, because it is linked to some pretty significant neuromuscular conditions that can develop over time. We think it's now linked to, it is linked to, there's a vitamin E deficiency muscle myopathy that we tend to see in horses in that sort of like middle age, 10 to teens kind of period. And that can be turned around quite quickly by getting them adequate vitamin E. And then if they get older and they live with vitamin E deficiency for a long time, there's potential that's linked to equine motor neurons disease. And that is not so recoverable. So vitamin E is really important.
So it's a simple blood test. You know, if your vet's out for whatever reason, if they draw blood, what would you test for? Vitamin E?
Yep, they'll just test for a serum vitamin E, and they'll send that. They have to send that away. It is not part of the mistake people make is they'll get like a CBC panel done, and it's not on a CBC or chem panel. So you actually have to specifically ask your vet for a vitamin E blood test because it's not on the regular panels you might get done. You know, so that is worth doing, and it's.
What about the other minerals? You know, like zinc, copper, whatever. Can you test blood for that?
You can. It's not super accurate, though. It's not the most accurate, you know, depiction of what your mineral status is like. And so really at the end of the day, the only way the minerals get in your body is, you know, through your mouth, you eat them. So, you know, making sure your diet is where it needs to be is the best way of making sure that your, you know, mineral status is where it needs to be. But this, you know, vitamin E is just a weird one. We just, for some reason, some horses metabolize it more quickly and burn through it faster than other horses. So, and I've done that. I've had clients who had 3 horses. They were fed the same thing. We pulled blood on them all, and they all had completely different vitamin E levels. It was fascinating.
Interesting.
So yeah, you can't, unfortunately, if you have a barn of 10 horses, you can't say, oh, we'll do, you know, number 1, 3, and 7. And just, you know, no, unfortunately, that's not a money set. You have to test everybody, unfortunately. But
yeah. Okay. All right. Well, you know, we're coming to the end of this conversation, and I'm mentally making notes of our next conversation because I'm like, I want to talk about, you know, evaluating different grasses and what kinds of grasses are high in vitamin E and low in this. So, you know, when you can focus on a particular topic or a handful of questions, it's a very manageable conversation. But when you think of just equine nutrition, the big picture of it, it can be very overwhelming. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come on here and talk to me about it. You have a podcast of your own, which is fantastic. Tell our listeners about it and where they can find out more.
Yeah, so my podcast is called Scoop and Scale, about mostly equine nutrition, and we talk about all kinds of things, but it's fun. It's fun to have that space just to chat about equine nutrition. But yeah, Scoop and Scale, and that's on all the various platforms, whatever platform you like to listen on.
Super. I will be sure to post links to that on the Stall and Stable show notes. Thank you, Dr. Clair Thunes. Did I get that right?
You did, yeah.
All right. Consulting equine nutritionist. Thank you so very much for your time.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
Well, thanks very much again to Dr. Clair Thunes. Thank you also to Triple Crown Nutrition, not only for sponsoring this episode, but for connecting me with Dr. Thunes. As we all know, keeping horses healthy does not happen in a vacuum. Whether it's nutrition or horsekeeping, pasture management, barn design, whatever it might be, we want to offer our horses the best that we can. And doing that starts with knowing what the best is. And sometimes that's a moving target. So we like to talk about it all the time here on Stall and Stable. I hope that you'll subscribe to the show, and we'll have more conversations like this one about equine nutrition. Again, thanks to Triple Crown, and more. To learn more about Triple Crown Nutrition, log on to their website at triplecrownfeed.com. And for detailed information about how to best outfit your barn, go to americanstalls.com. And that's going to be a wrap for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it.